Welcome. Thank you to the Apprenticeship Employment Network for hosting the National Skills Week Industry Workshop. Never before has skills reform been more critical to our nation. Ensuring our workforce has the skills we need for the jobs of the future is critical for rebuilding our economy, especially in the post-COVID environment. Collaboration between government, industry and the community will be vital to the success of our recovery. And it goes without saying that the Morrison government is committed to supporting Australians to stay and work. However, we also need Australians better trained for the jobs needed. And to do that, we need real reform when it comes to skills training in Australia. So we have prioritised skills development as part of the JobMaker strategy, which is designed to set Australia up for the economic success over the next 3 to 5 years. Our multi-billion skills package provides a significant boost to the vet sector. This includes our supporting apprentices and trainees wage subsidy that is providing timely, targeted and scalable support to businesses to keep on their existing apprentices and trainees. This builds on the establishment of the National Careers Institute and the National Skills Commission. These two organisations are working together to strengthen, streamline and improve the delivery of and access to careers information in Australia. Again, I'd like to thank the Apprenticeship Employment Network for hosting this industry workshop, and I hope that you enjoyed today's session. Thanks.
I've just outlined the origins of our work. Our prime concern is skills and jobs. And the key issue we think is worth exploring is, this is Skills Week, right? So everyone here is interested in training, traineeships, skills and the like. It's too easy in the middle of a crisis to say what we've got to do is just educate people more. What motivates Lisa and Gary and myself is skills are fantastic. You know, we love learning. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But skills on their own will not create employment. And so we've really got to think hard about the job creation side of things, because that's required to make skills useful. And if you don't have the demand for jobs there, you can have the best trained workforce ever, and you won't solve the crisis. In fact, it's been a research insight, or not insight, it's fairly statement obvious. Australia's now got the best trained unemployed workforce it's ever had. I mean, let's not forget that. We put a huge amount of money into education and training, and for about the last 30 years, levels of education attainment have gone up, but as you'll see, problems in the labour market have persisted. So we've really got to think about what we've got to do to turn the labour market around. To put it in context, I think it's just worth reminding ourselves that life before the current situation was far from perfect. Economists used to run around and say Australia was one of the kind of top performing countries in the world. Unemployment never got really out of hand, you know, but even so, let's remember there was 5% unemployment. There was around 9 to 10% underemployment. So that means one worker in 6 was basically looking for more hours of work. The OECD did a very important research in the mid-2010s, and it identified that on top of that, there's another 20% of the workforce that's basically given up looking for work. So that means when you put the unemployment, the underemployment and the joblessness together, you're looking at around a third of the workforce. And remember, this is before COVID. There's always been, and there has been for about the last 20 years, the problem of casualisation and contractors. And wages were stagnant for the 7 years going into the crisis. Real wages for most people were stagnant. People were living in situations of chronic understaffing. And if you did have a job and you're a full-timer, often people had the problem of extended hours of work. So that was the situation before the crisis hit. Education and training had similar problems. There were skill shortages and declining employer investment in training. Early childhood education and care in Australia is one of the most expensive in the OECD. This audience will know that the vet system's been plagued by scandals. They are not problems of rotten apples spoiling a good system. They're a legacy of inherent design flaws which are still there. And the university system is underfunded and completely dependent on foreign students to remain viable. And then on top of that, we've got the home loan affordability crisis and then the shortage of social housing. just to ram home one of the important points for this audience, we hear a lot about the need for the education system to be more responsive to the economy. This is data from the ABS, which looks at how workers get their training and how they get their skills. And it shows the trends from 2005 to 2016, 2017. And you see overall, the proportion of the workforce that's been involved in training has slipped from around 1 worker in 2 to only 2 workers in 5. Now, that's not because people have given up on educating themselves. In fact, the proportion of the workforce that's putting themselves through formal learning has increased. What has crashed is the employer contribution to training on the job. So in 2005, 35.9% of Australian workers were reporting that the employers were giving them work-related training. That's dropped to 1 in 5. So when we're talking about problems in skills and training, let's focus on the real issue. It's commonplace these days to say universities are unresponsive or vet system's not working properly. The deepest problem of all in our training system is declining employer contribution. And we've really got to grasp that by the middle, because this is brilliant data. The ABS has put that out, but it's not the data that gets much coverage. And it's, you know, I'd like to talk about it more in questions if you're interested. So where are we at now? How is the government trying to get us out of the current situation? I like to characterise this as the emergency department model, right? We saw this in the GFC. When the market economy went into crisis, all ideology went out the window and people said we've got to throw as much money as we can at the economy to make up for market failures. And I call this, you know, the massive short-run injections to preserve life as we know it. So there's JobKeeper, JobSeeker. These are good things. I think this is fantastic. But it's very much seen as an emergency response. It's not seen as integral to changing the course of the evolution of our labour market. Job trainers propping up some parts of the apprenticeship system, and there's some tax relief for small business. We're moving to the longer term vision now, and this is moving basically to the business as usual outlook for how you solve a crisis. So there's talk of massive infrastructure, talk of massive tax cuts. You might remember Josh Frydenberg a couple of weeks ago was talking about taking a playbook out of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher's playbooks. Let's remember this. At the time, George Bush Senior called this philosophy voodoo economics. So we've got a government that's actually drawing down on a voodoo vision of how you solve things, and that comes through in their vision of labour standards, and it's also coming through in their vision of education and training. As you'll see, I'm from the University of Sydney. I've been following the debates closely in education. Dan Tehan and the government now is saying they want the universities to take an extra 100,000 places, and we're basically not going to give you any more money. We're going to make students pay more. So this is the vision of education reform. They know education is counter-cyclical, but they're basically going to make the students pay for it, and they're basically going to make arts and humanities students pay for it. And then there's the usual bash the unemployed. We've seen this with the government saying we've got to really wind back on JobKeeper because there's anecdotal evidence that some people on JobKeeper aren't taking up work. Presumably many people on this presentation have got associations with employers. The stories I'm getting back are employers are getting overwhelmed with job applications. So there may be 1 or 2 anecdotal stories about people on JobKeeper, but the stories I see are massive applications. So the outcome of the current trajectory will be an intensification of prior trends towards inequality. So what can we do about this? Well, I think the key thing to keep in mind is that underlying all the problems we have at the moment is insufficient demand. Josh Frydenberg likes to use the expression that the government is already spending eye-watering amounts of money that are making the government go into debt. And that's true. I mean, full credit to the government. They have spent a huge amount of money in the recent past in the emergency department model. I think that's great. But the thing is, they're showing great reluctance to continue that kind of behaviour. And the Grattan Institute and people at Deloitte Access Economics have done the numbers, they're macroeconomists, and they've said as a result of the crisis, we should be thinking of spending, they're saying 70 to 90 billion dollars over the next 2 years. Now, I've apportioned that equally between these years. That's my cut, not theirs. But they've said combined, we need to be looking at spending 70 to 90 billion. To date, the government has said it is only going to spend 20 billion. And so what I've said is the shortfalls we're looking at this year are between 15 to 45 billion and 35 to 45 billion the year out. Excuse me. So how's the government going to fill the gap? Well, this is where we're hearing talk about labour market and training flexibility. For them, you know, there's going to be a supply side revolution, which will actually make up for this gap. But that is a phenomenal gap. I mean, let's keep this in mind. You could solve all the problems in the childcare sector, and there's been important work done by social ventures on this. Important, you could solve many of the problems in the childcare sector for around 5 billion over the next 3 or 4 years. So there's a lot of money needed, but equally there's a lot of need, and this is where I'll elaborate. So while the federal government's looking towards labour market and education flexibility, Laura Tingle and ACOS make the rather obvious point, no, the gap will be filled by mass poverty on a scale we've never seen. So while you have a gap of that magnitude, it's pie in the sky, absolutely pie in the sky to think that flexibility can fill that gap. Mass poverty on current trajectories is the more likely outcome. But that's not inevitable. And the ACTU has done important work in actually going through the different sectors and seeing how you could actually spend extra money to make a huge difference. And it's not just the ACTU, there's important work being done in the renewable energy sector around the Green New Deal. There's the job guarantee idea being put around by Bill Mitchell and Noel Pearson. The ACTU provides a very helpful starting point though, because they've actually put numbers against the different issues they have in mind. So they're saying for early childhood education and care, this is basically giving all Australian children the right to a good start in life. And this is, look, I think it's an inherently good idea for citizenship. I think every young Australian should be given, you know, the right to an education, but it just makes really good economic sense. Even conservative economists know that every dollar spent for a child in their first to third years saves literally around 10 times that amount over the rest of their life if you get it right. So that, yes, that's good in itself, but it's also a good long-run investment. The ACTU is also strongly supportive of big interventions around the apprenticeship system and extending JobKeeper to the universities. That's how you would account for that money there. They are very keen on rediscovering Australia. This is a commitment to building up tourism, hospitality and the arts sector. They're very open to upgrading infrastructure, and they've got a whole plan for manufacturing. So you can see Grattan and Deloitte say these are the kind of numbers that are needed. The ACTU's offered ideas on how that money could be spent. The work that Gary, Lisa and I have done is looked very much at, well, what do the jobs look like? If we are going to have investments of this kind of magnitude, how would we organise to do that? And we've said that in thinking about the jobs that we need to create, it's worth separating out 3 distinct segments of the labour market. Irony of ironies, in the midst of mass unemployment, employers are still complaining of skill shortages. So any jobs and skill strategies should look at bottlenecks in the economy. And this is in areas like construction at the moment, parts of IT, parts of the health sector that need, even parts of agriculture, need special sectoral programs to unblock skill bottlenecks. But that's almost incidental. The main game is going to be around the areas of local disadvantage and young people. Let's remember, going into this recession, I gave you the aggregate numbers that the Australian labour market was in a pretty parlous state. But those averages hide huge problems. And in some local labour markets, particularly in parts of southwestern Sydney, parts of northwestern Adelaide, parts of northwest Melbourne and the like, there are significant pockets, long-term disadvantage. And so we think we need to have a strategy to deal with that. And clearly there's been a collapse in the youth labour market. I mean, the youth labour market's been in deep secular change since the 70s. I mean, let's remember, as late as 1972, around 2/3 of Australians, in fact, over 2/3 of Australians left school at 15. Right? They didn't even finish high school. We're now at a point where it's around, I don't know, about 70% finish high school. And so in the past, when students left schools, they went into full-time work. Now, we all know that full-time work for youths disappeared and they moved into part-time work. But even now in the current crisis, that part-time work's disappearing, and new internships for people leaving university like is drying up dramatically. So we've said there are 3 types of initiatives needed. One around strategic skills development, one around local jobs creation, and one around a youth guarantee. And we give concrete examples of how this could actually work. So we've outlined the principles that could be pursued there, and I'm happy to answer this in questions if you like. But these ideas have come from quite concrete examples that have been successful. So if we're thinking about strategic interventions, in the mining industry in Australia, we all know there was a resources boom. A very creative program was put together called the National Apprenticeship Program. And this used group training in concert with a network of employers to pick up people who had, say, 1/3 of the skills or half the skills needed to get skilled work needed in mining. And then the mining industry, in concert with the group training company, accelerated the rounding out of those people so that they could get a full ensemble of skills relevant to particular trades, particularly in the fabrication, metal fabrication, machining, and in electrical. On the local job side, there is a rich history that Australia can learn from. In the downturn that happened in the late 70s, early 80s, Community Employment Program put hundreds of people through hundreds of thousands of people through short-term jobs as a way of acculturating them back into the norms of work, so that as the economy recovered, they could be absorbed quickly back into the labour market. Those ideas were taken further by the Breaking the Unemployment Cycle in Queensland, which was the Beattie government stepping up and saying, after the downturn in the early 90s, there was still persistent unemployment and all arms of policy had to be deployed to fix that. In Geelong, there's a group called Growing Regional Opportunities for Work, and they've done important networking and getting together local employers to identify opportunities for labour demand and then filling those with people locally. And in around Warrnambool in Western Victoria, the group training company out there has had a 1,000 jobs in 5 years campaign where they've actually gone out and not just filled placements, but actually worked to create new positions to be filled in concert with the local employers. When it comes to the youth guarantee, there's important lessons coming out of the UK at the moment, which the Victorian government's picked up. The Brotherhood of St Lawrence has, over the last couple of years, been building up a national youth employment body that has a network across 9 different regions, which has identified new ways of linking youth to potential employment. And in the group training area, there were important pilots around the multi-industry pre-apprenticeship program, which gives people access and insight into different domains of work and allows them to make contact with employers across a range of skills instead of having to make one call about where they want to try things out. What's underpinning all these ideas is that they're publicly enabled skills and employment partnerships. Right. In moving forward in job creation, the government can't do this on its own, but sure as hell the private sector can't do it at the moment, given they're flat on their back. So this whole idea of partnership and power sharing is critical. It can only succeed, however, if there's serious job creation commitments at scale by the federal government, and all arms of policy support this, particularly industry policy and social procurement. Group training, we think, is very important because this is a risky business. When you create jobs and you take someone on, you're never quite sure, if you're an employee, you're never quite sure how demand is going to unfold. And the beauty of the group training model is that you allow that risk to be shared across a network of employers, with the intermediary group training playing the vital link. So at the core of the new arrangements, however, there's got to be an anchor. This just can't be free-floating policy ideas. And Gary, Lisa and I are strongly of the view that the group training network and TAFE need to provide anchors in local labour markets to ensure some coherence and a commitment to quality pervades the initiatives. So what are some possible next moves? I see I've nearly taken half an hour, so I'll build through this quickly. We can come back to it if you like. But what we've said, here are our three initiatives: the Strategic Skills Initiative, the Local Jobs Initiative, the Youth Guarantee. And we need to think about what we do in the next 12 months and then what we do the year after. So very much the next 12 months is just getting people into some kind of work, moving quickly, and it's got to be predominantly public sector funded. Over time, we need to integrate into other activities that are going on in the private sector. But before you can get collaborations with the private sector going, you've got to build up the infrastructure. And so you've got to get stronger TAFEs, stronger unis, stronger group training, and stronger inter-union and non-government organisation collaboration to provide the means of delivering on this more ambitious program. So we do think that we've got to be nuanced. You know, whilst the private sector is just struggling to keep its head above water, the government must step in. But in doing that, it doesn't just do stopgap measures, it's also got to do some institution building to provide a platform for moving into the future. So there is a key problem that I think we need to address, and this is a Skills Week conference, and I think you probably more than most will appreciate this. The immediate challenge is job creation. There's absolutely no doubt about that. We've now got millions of people either unemployed or underemployed. But there is also a parallel challenge: what is being done to the Australian education and skills system. There are pushes at the moment to have focus on developing what's called a national uniform price as the way to regulate VET. This really misses the point. What's the use of having a national uniform price if the underlying quality of the system is questionable? And in the higher education sector, we've got a very ramshackle set of ideas being put forward by a government which seems to have given these about half an hour's notice. We've really got to think hard about what we do with higher education. You cannot expect 100,000 people to be absorbed into the system over the next 10 years. Simply on the basis of increased levies put on students. We as a society need to think about what kind of investment we're putting into both TAFE and universities. So I just pose that out there as saying to talk about the immediate challenge is job creation, but there are deeper structural changes going on that I don't think we can neglect. So how are we to conclude? There's a huge gap between the expenditure need and the expenditure underway. We have successful lessons of what to do. You'll note just about every example I gave you was Australian. It's not saying, you know, turn Australia into Norway or turn Australia into Denmark. It's actually building off what we've done in the past. Currently, the federal government is walking away from this investment and has instead been talking about supply side measures around flexibility in the labour market and flexibility in the training system. The key issue is funding creative partnerships so we can build back better. We need to be nuanced. In the short run, the public sector has to do the heavy lifting. But whilst we're doing that short run intervention, we've got to think about building up the infrastructure that can allow us to move on to a more sustainable, jobs-rich path of recovery over the next 2 or 3 years. So I got that in under half an hour. So thank you. So Gary, I think you'll have to take down the slides, mate. I'm not used to go to.
That's okay. We can do that. Hang on 2 seconds, John. Where are we?
Actually, I did it, mate. I worked it out.
I was about to say, that's all good. Okay, look, that was a great summary, John, and 30 minutes too. I think that's your record when we're presenting this so far. So well Again, we're keen to get some input from the audience today to see Do you strongly agree with what we're doing or violently disagree? These were certainly conversations that we've had, obviously, with John and Lisa over a few months now. And again, I think my position is it's great that we've sort of met the current need and business as usual, keeping businesses sort of in survival mode. But what are we going to do over the next 6 to 12 months? We're about to have another group of school leavers enter either the workforce or the university and TAFE sector over the coming months. And youth unemployment's already sitting at around 16%, with JobKeeper still going. So, there's going to be some critical things that are going to need to happen in this space in 2021 if we're going to get youth unemployment numbers back under control. So again, happy to take questions. I know in these environments, sometimes it's a little bit daunting to put a question up. There's a chat room there if people want to ask any specific questions of the data that John's put forward. I have a question there from SP. Can John explain the German-style apprenticeship authority that he mentioned in one of the slides?
Sure. Look, the short answer is the Germans value their vocational education system so much that they have an authority that's called the BIP. It's like the National Apprenticeship Authority of Germany. It has equal employer, union, government and educator representation. And it has an authority pretty much like the Reserve Bank. So it's not just an advisory body. They big debates about the curriculum. They have quite some influence over resource allocation, and they have quite deep analytical capacity for ascertaining what's going on in the workforce. But it's not just a separate authority. Like in Australia, we had a thing called the Australian National Training Authority. The real power of the German situation is that it has deep roots into local economies. So you've got to remember that the German employers as a class basically accept they've got a fundamental responsibility for training. So the apprenticeship authority works hand in glove with the chambers of commerce, and their chambers of commerce are serious. They are involved in education and assessment, and they are built around people who actually understand vocational education. They don't see it as an opportunity just simply to make money through funding models.
John, I guess the other important part about some of those European models also is they're there to really match supply and demand. So in terms of the workforce needs for employers, they're really forward thinking in terms of what's our skills needs look like over the short, medium and long term. And then they're actually directing people into those trades to make sure that they've got their skills needs covered by their local communities.
But you've got to remember there's been important work done, particularly by Swiss researchers, who've shown that even though you might be trained in a particular trade, the skills you get are quite transferable. So the Swiss, for example, do a lot of training around clock and watchmaking, but there's not a huge demand for that. But the skills you get from the infrastructure that they have around their employers can then be moved into the medical devices sector or into other parts of advanced manufacturing. So they have quite a sophisticated view. The Germanic countries call it occupational flexibility. So it's not labour market flexibility, it's being trained in a core domain of expertise, but then being able to use the deep insights you get from that to move to other areas. Can I also say there's quite some difference in the European systems. The German system is under a lot of stress at the moment, and that's primarily because of the deepening inequality. And as inequality deepens, parents want to get their kids out of blue-collar work and into the universities. If you contrast that to Denmark and Norway, the apprenticeship systems there are a lot stronger because inequality's been kept under control. So I'm not saying Germany's got all the solutions, but they're a lot further down the track than we are in having a credible vocational education system.
Yeah. And I guess the other real difference in a lot of those countries is they start their vocational education a lot earlier. So 15, 16 vetting school programs are the norm, and the majority of students go through a vet in schools pathway.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, we have another question here from Jackie. She says, if Australia has the best trained unemployed workforce, apart from early education, what should school leavers seek to get trained in to secure a job? When we have a look at the unemployment data and I know the Commonwealth put out their Jobs Australia report every year. Health is a big sector that's underutilised, and we've got plenty of job openings with an ageing workforce. I think construction was the second largest, and then those professional services like IT, finance, a whole range of sort of emerging technologies I think was third. Happy for John or Lisa to expand on that.
Yeah, I also think it's important that, look, the Australian labour market is going to be awash with unemployed people for quite some time. And, you know, Gary, Lisa and I are doing everything we can to try and stop that outcome eventuating. But I think it's going to be hard. And I do think people, even in these times, have got to think about doing what they do well. Because if you master a craft, that can become a platform for you doing other things. So Kim Williams, for example, was a major executive with Rupert Murdoch, and his first degree was in music, right? And he's given a very good presentation on how music is good training to move into organisational and administrative work and management. And so I think sometimes people can get themselves into a bit of a mess if they go for an area where they think there's jobs and then they're not very good at it. And that way they fall between two stools. They haven't pursued what they've loved, and then they're actually going to be right down the pecking order when it comes to selection of jobs in a labour market where there's a surfeit of labour. So yes, Gary's correctly identified the sectors where there is big demand, but you know, if you're no good at maths, don't do data science. You know, if you don't like working, you know, on a project basis in hard and arduous conditions, don't go into construction, because employers will pick up very quickly whether you are really have your heart in it. And if you have built up a deep area of expertise, like I gave that example in the Swiss, they train watchmakers, but they end up in the medical devices sector. You've got to think laterally about what you do with your advanced analytical and dexterous skills.
Yep.
Yeah, I might just say, you know, one of the central challenges that I guess we've been talking about and trying to think about is that a hell of a lot of people do, let's say they go to TAFE and they do an IT qualification, and the outcomes from that, and from university degrees, by the way, even though IT in theory is a growth area of the economy, are poor. So it's that underlying waste, both of time and money, and you know, aspiration, that is the cost of having a system where the labour market and skills system are too far away. The only place where they're integrated is in the traditional trades, where if you go in, you've already secured a relationship, and your chances of coming out the other end and moving into that domain of work are very high. But everywhere else, it's a bit of a lottery whether you actually get to work in the area that you studied. So as John said, I mean, in terms of, you know, your own kids or telling kids what to do, at least if you find something you're passionate about, you have the basis to try to pursue that. But the central policy problem that we're trying to grapple with, and really interested in the thoughts of people in this webinar, is how do we get employers to connect jobs more to the training system? How can we make sure that if you go into an IT qualification, if you want to study IT, there is a much better chance that you'll end up doing something in that domain, something that uses those skills. We've got to get a better integration in those systems.
Thanks, Lisa. And again, I think some of the options we put forward in John's presentation around starting this earlier, starting pre-apprenticeship programs with some physical workplace-based component. So you're matching jobs with individuals that potentially could fill those roles, and getting employers involved early, I think, is a good way of getting secure employment and decent jobs at the end of it. Okay, we have another question from Janet Nicholson. With all the politics around government expenditure and debt, how do you suggest your proposals would be paid for and the electorate accept that this type of expenditure is required? $1 million question, Janet, or $1 billion question, maybe.
Well, that's pretty easy to answer at the moment. I mean, the Reserve Bank has told the government, you got all the money you want. I mean, let's be quite clear about this. You know, Philip Lowe addressed the National Cabinet the other day saying, I've gone as far as I can go on interest rate cuts. It's only if the government picks up the mantle and spends that we can get our way out of this. Now, he hasn't said spend it on anything you can think of. He said be thoughtful and strategic in how you do it. But he hasn't said don't spend. Right? That's not the message. In fact, if you look at what the OECD is saying, if you look at what the IMF is saying, or the World Bank is saying, I think the OECD has been pretty explicit about this. They say we got it wrong after the GFC. We started to move to austerity too quickly, and that led to significant social and political damage. So you saw the gyrations that happened in Europe around, first of all, Greece. Then you've seen the rise of Le Pen and Brexit. And you've seen the rise of Trump in the US. They're recognising that if the government doesn't take responsibility for solving a deep social crisis, because an economic crisis is not just confined to the economy, it's a social crisis, you lose the whole show. And they lost the whole show completely in Venezuela because they were doctrinaire. And so the economic orthodoxy of today is where Grattan and where Deloitte Access Economics is at. You know, they're not reckless left-wing economists out there saying, you know, spend like a drunken sailor because we, you know, want to build socialism in our time. They are mainstream economists who are saying in a crisis of this magnitude, only the government can save us. And they've got the authority of some of the most conservative economic bodies in the world buttressing on that. So that's not the problem. The problem's the political will. And the problem is where you're spending it. You know, do you want to spend it on Crown Casino, which is the second biggest beneficiary of JobKeeper, and do you want to spend it on home renovations, or do you want to spend it on childcare and quality vocational education? This government's making very clear decisions about what it's supporting, and it would much rather look after Crown Casino than it would look after childcare and universities. That's a political choice. That's not an economic one. That's a political choice.
Thanks, John. We've got another question here from SP. And again, this might be a whole other topic, but how do the Nordic education and higher education systems operate in comparison to Australia? Why are they so successful? We get this question a lot, John, in various forums.
Right, okay. Well, the first thing to note here is that the Nordics aren't all the same. Right, so Denmark, Norway, Sweden and Finland are not all the same. Denmark and Norway have strong trade training systems. They're, if you like, more like the German. The Finns and the Swedes have a far more traditional education-based model, right? And the Swedes are augmented that with active labour market policy. All of them had their roots in social democratic governments. So they took the view that you had to build up the citizenry. I mean, I can go on for this all day if you want, but I mean, let's remember the reason the Swedes developed their welfare state is that up into the 30s, Sweden had negative population growth, right? Babies were dying at a faster rate than they were being born, right? Sweden was the basket case of Europe, and the welfare state emerged to keep babies alive. And from that point, they said, we've also got to develop our citizenry. We just don't keep babies alive. We give people a chance to retrain if they lose their jobs. We're going to raise education levels. So it was that notion that society's wealth had to be shared. But even that within that, there were choices, and the Swedes and the Finns ran down their trades, whereas the Norwegians and the Danes have built up their trades. So it's not like there's one Swedish, one Nordic model. Within that, there are choices, but underlying it all is a political choice. And it's the same Australia. Australia had a political choice to make in the 1890s when we had our big depression at the end of the 19th century. The trade training system was on the ropes. It was on the verge of disintegration. The thing that saved it was the emergence of publicly funded technical education. And if you're in Sydney, make sure you get to Mary Ann Street and you go to Sydney Technical College, because you'll see that's a cathedral to the trades. There was a big decision made, we're going to back the trades, and that was inscribed in bricks and mortar in a kind of arts and crafts movement building, and that was supported by arbitration. The Americans at the same time had a similar crisis, and the employers said, great, this is our chance to get rid of the trades once and for all, and they were successful. So we have choices. Just because the Nordics had a social democratic experience of the 20th century is instructive, but we've got to look at what's in front of us now. And I think what we've got choices we can make too. And we don't necessarily have to do what they did, but we've got to recognise it is not inevitable that we have to look like America or we have to look at a deregulated market. I think we should be building on things like group training, building on things like TAFE. These are very rare assets in the English-speaking world. Like group training, and people in Australia take group training for granted. I don't think any other country in the world has as big a network as a proportional labour market as Australia has in this. So that's the kind of thing we should be thinking about. So like I say, happy to talk about Nordic social and labour history, but I think we should also be thinking about what the choices are before us.
Okay, I'm mindful of time. I've got a couple of more questions, but they're very similar. So I guess the next question's around how do we start to bring employers along with this journey? How do we actually get them engaged back into the vocational education system? I
think that is the question. I think that is the best question. I don't have an answer to that. I've spent, this is a personal thing, an admission of failure. My research interest since I joined the university system in the early 90s is how do you nurture multi-employer collaboration to increase choice in the labour market, right? There are real problems in employment, there are real problems in skills, they're public good issues, there are risks involved. And I don't have a simple answer to that. All I know is that there are some really good employers out there, right? I've seen them in construction, I've seen them in health, I've seen them in aged care. Unfortunately, they're not the majority. And I think the challenge moving forward is how do you empower those employers who do have a deep commitment and a deep competence? I'm doing work in Wales at the moment, looking at the future of their further education system. And the thing we've identified there are the leading employers, and we call them the shining lights. Like if you think the Australian economy is crooked, have a look at the Welsh economy. I mean, they are in serious problems. But what the shining lights, we've studied them in quite some detail. And what's interesting about them is that they're very modest. They're very good at what they do, and they actually don't want to expand out of control. And so the challenge is there are good employers out there, but they're very humble. And somehow we've got to try and get them to be a little more ambitious. That's a lot easier to do if there's a government that is supportive of them. So this is where politics does help. If you had a government that was prepared to put in a levy and support the good employers. I studied the training guarantee. You may or may not remember that Australia used to have a training levy in the early 90s, and all the good employers really liked it. Now, there was this chorus of criticism that came from the peak employer bodies that were looking after the rat bags who didn't want to pay it. But the good employers said, we're doing this anyway, it's a tax, it doesn't worry us because we're already spending the money. So that's what I mean. If you can get a government in place that empowers the good employers, I think that's the way forward. Just from a historical point of view, the other way you get employers to act together and in a collective fashion is when there's a threat from unions. So if there's basically, you've got to either empower the good employers with government, or you've got to basically scare them so much they've got to collaborate because there's a threat from unions. To me, from 30 years of research, that seems to be the only way forward. But I am genuinely interested in that question. I am always looking for new leads on that.
The long-term problem is one of the big dilemmas But if we accept that in the next couple of years, the government is going to be one of the governments are going to be some of the few entities that have the capacity to expand and to spend, then we should think about governments as employers. So the federal government, 145,000 employees, 1,200 trainees, including graduate trainees. So, you know, when I left school, it was the big public utilities and the governments that were really, you know, bringing in, like training up huge numbers of people. There is an opportunity there for government, both as direct employer, but also as funder, as some of those big growth sectors like health, disability, childcare, to really anchor training and work. So anchor a new approach to training and work. So, you know, that is, as John said, it's a really political question. Are they willing to do it? Are they willing to get into the market? Are they willing to expand even their own training of their own workers? They're all really big political questions. But it's there, you know, it could be turned on tomorrow. Local government could employ a ton more people tomorrow. We desperately need the aged care sector to do something to build the quality of the jobs and to integrate training into that. There are lots of opportunities in the current crisis, and, you know, I guess that's the sort of area that perhaps we can start to move the dial a bit.
Gary, is Meg Parkinson, can I add to that, please?
No problem at all. Go for it, Meg.
Well, it seems to me that group training organisations are, excuse me, I just moved. My way of thinking, what they're there for is, well, one of the things is to assist small business in employing trainees and or apprentices, because when you can no longer do it because of circumstances outside your control, those people can move to another job in the same general area and continue their training and their study. And small business in Australia is a very big sector, especially if you include the small end of medium-sized businesses. And it is has numerous problems with cash flow, etc., from banks, and in my industry from supermarkets who rip us all off. And generally there are a lot of problems, and the GTOs are there to assist rather than sort of look to the past and wonder about how we can bring it back. It is more useful to tweak the system we have to mean that more small businesses are aware of GTOs and how they can be of use to them for their business and for people who want to train, which means that careers advisors need to know more about them, because I assure you the ones I've come across certainly don't. And also small business organisations and small businesses in general.
I think you're spot on, Meg, and you're certainly preaching to the converted here. We know Australia is made up of a lot of small businesses, and they are a large employer collectively. It's a little frustrating that, you know, the Commonwealth don't fund group training at all. And in the states like Victoria, our group training funding hasn't increased in the last 20 years. So it's difficult to do what we used to do 20 years ago with the funds that have, you know, with CPI and everything else is no more today than what it was back then. I think there's going to need to be a range of measures. I think, you know, big employers and government can stimulate some of the initial increase in employment, and then GTOs can certainly help create that flexibility and support needed for small businesses to take on additional youth as well. So it's going to be a multi-pronged approach, I think, to get youth unemployment back under control. But I think group training is going to be key, especially because we've got such a wide network. You know, just about every regional town across Australia has a link to a group training organisation at some level. So I think John mentioned that earlier today. We've got a really strong existing network that the government underutilised and underappreciated, and there's an opportunity for them to tap into it. All right. I see it's a couple of minutes to 11. Sorry, Meg.
Sorry, just to add that relationships between your association and other business, agricultural, all those associations.
The internet connection wasn't great there for me. I'm not sure about others, but look, I thank everyone for their time and efforts today. John and Lisa, especially for your hard work over the last few months putting this together and putting up with my views and banging on about group training. John's been a long-term supporter of group training, so thank you for all your work in this space over many years. As we said earlier, the slides will be available for people. We're happy to take ongoing questions. And yeah, thank you for all your support, and thanks for your time today.